Can everyone hear me at the back? Is that okay? Cool. I can see hands up at the back side. There we go. So let me just adjust this a bit. So who am I? As I said, I'm Peter Suter. I'm a senior pro service engineer at Puppet Labs. I've been at Puppet for 2 years. I've been using Puppet for, I say, close to 6 years now. It says 5 on there. But yeah, so I'm a senior pro service engineer, so I work with customers. I do stuff like this. I do talks and things like that, but I also work in the community, and I like opening pull requests on modules that I use. So I should give a quick warning before I start, is that I speak quite quickly. Even now, like the brain power to make sure that I don't speak at my normal speed, which is like this, is like taking up half my brain, and remembering my slides is the other half. So if I go too fast, someone just wave, or just say slow down, and I'll see if I can calm myself down a bit. And also, I should probably put this disclaimer up as someone who is not a lawyer or an auditor, or signed an NDA for your company or anything like that. Make sure that anything I advise in here, you don't just, hopefully you shouldn't need to be warned about something like this, but it does happen. Don't just take the stuff I'm talking about and just go and implement it in your company without talking to someone who knows what they're talking about first. So why are we here? Show of hands in the room. Who has to deal with some sort of compliance at their company? Well, it's a lot of people. So it makes sense because it's the kind of talk. So what is compliance and what does it actually mean? So there's a pretty good definition here from the Computer Weekly website. Basically, compliance, the TLDR, is that there is some sort of legal obligation, or not always legal, sometimes it's just an agreement, like a framework. But basically, someone has told you that there are a set of rules that you need to follow. And this is a kind of a side thing here, but it's an important note that compliance is not security, or more accurately, compliance doesn't directly correlate to security. It's a part of a secure kind of framework you have your company, but just because something is compliant doesn't mean it's going to be secure. It might help, but it's not just that. And a good explanation, and I'll put a link to this blog post later on, is basically compliance is the discipline of verification at scale. Because the general idea is that if you think about your system, if you had to document every single file that's on there and how they're working, it's going to be pretty difficult. So compliance is basically just a framework around making sure that at your company you've got an agreed upon kind of framework for how you're doing things. And as people who probably put their hand up, and so people who put their hand up for compliance, put your hand up if the compliance or sort of stuff you have to do at your company just gets thrown over the wall at the last minute. There's a few hands there, okay. So the thing about compliance is it often kind of straddles different organizational silos. At least with some of the customers I've worked with, compliance is sometimes literally there is a compliance team which is separate from the security team, which is separate from the operations team, which is bad generally. The whole point of DevOps is it's not just a buzzword, it's for everyone to kind of work together on the same team. But because of that, compliance often ends up being thrown over the wall at the last minute. Someone just comes in and goes, oh, I ran a Nessus scan across your network, you need to fix all this stuff. And that kind of stuff needs to be brought into your kind of workflows. But regardless of what the definition of compliance is, or if you even want to do it, a lot of the times you don't get the choice, and someone's told you that you need to follow the rules. So there's an alphabet soup of all the various acronyms and things that you need to follow there. These are quite American biased because a lot of the research online is American biased, but the ones you probably recognize from up there, if you're not American or you're working in Europe, probably going to be PCI DSS, maybe ITIL and some others, STIG maybe if you're doing work in the States. There's a bunch up there. And even if you're not following any sort of governmental compliance or legal kind of requirements, you might have compliance based on an agreed upon framework internally. So you might just have a set of what most people call hardening policies. So they're not directly correlated to some governmental standard, but they're just this is what we need to do to get stuff working at our company. And in that, this is one that comes up quite a lot, the Center for Internet Security. It's basically a kind of non-governmental fork of the STIG standards. But this is fairly popular because a lot of banks and stuff, they get scared of using something like STIG because it's explicitly made by companies, organizations like the NSA, and they're a bit worried about that kind of stuff. So CIS is the CIS is the kind of more business-friendly version of it. But essentially, a lot of those, and we'll see later on, a lot of those CIS or like compliance standards are pretty similar to STIG, if not the same. And yeah, I got another reason that CIS is pretty popular is that it covers a lot of stuff. So it's a huge list there. But you can pretty much see most of the things that you can think of. You know, FreeBSD, Microsoft, various databases, Amazon, Linux, and things like that. You know, it covers a lot of different areas there. So the thing about compliance is that another good note on compliance is that sometimes it doesn't directly correlate to actual technical requirements. You have to dig through a lot of legalese to actually find something that you can work on directly with code. So an example is the HIPAA, which is basically just an American law around health insurance in the States. So this is the actual text of the requirements around that. So if you look at something like that, and if you actually go to that website, you have the full, because the whole compliance stuff around HIPAA is basically, it was written for senators and for lawmakers and stuff like that. So you have to take this document that's in legalese and drill down to what you actually need to know. So if we go through that, we need to look at 45 CFR Part 60 and Parts A and C of Part 164. So let's go and do that. So you have a bunch of headlines like this, and you know, if you're bored, maybe you go through each single one of them looking for them. But the bit you probably care about, this bit here, the technical safeguards. So technical safeguards seems like something that we care about. So these are the technical safeguards, and some of these are more kind of engineering problems, and some of them can't really be covered by config management. So some of these will be directly config management tools, and some of these will be maybe installed by config management tools. So the idea that you have to have specific logins and you have auditability, maybe you can't do that with your config management, but an LDAP tool that then logs into some sort of syslog or something like that, which you then audit. So your config management tool helps with that, but it can't work directly. And basically the level of compliance you can give and the difficulty you have with compliance is directly correlated with how friendly or how kind of adversarial you are with your auditors. Because at the end of the day, the auditors are the ones that actually decide whether you're in compliance or not. So depending on how your auditing is being done, whether it's an internal team or an external team, you ultimately have to work with them. And it can be an adversarial relationship, but it's a bad idea because, as I said, they're the ones that hold the key to actually getting signed off. So it's good to work with them on this kind of stuff. The problem with this is that a lot of the time compliance is a manual process, especially if you're in a company that hasn't gone through this kind of DevOps kind of transformation or any sort of agile transformation there. A lot of these processes are being kept in emails or in PDFs or even dead trees. You've got, I've seen pictures of here is our compliance stack, and it's just a stack of paper this big if someone's printed off a STIG standard or something like that. Or the worst storage of information, which is humans, because humans are an unsolved problem in IT. It's very hard to get information from one human to another a lot of the time, especially if you're in an adversarial kind of relationship there. So, put on my best infomercial voice, there's got to be a better way. So if you think about it, what is IT compliance? It's a series of rules for systems that need to be enforced and reported on. And what is configuration management? It's a series of rules for systems that need to be enforced and reported on. So we can use config management tools for this stuff. And if you're here, you probably have a little bit of experience with this. So what's the advantage of actually doing that? We've got reduced cost and time per release. Automating stuff makes things better. It means that you have a sort of agreed upon standard for things. You've got the idea of sharing and reuse, and I'm going to talk about so Isaac Newton once said, you need to stand on the shoulders of giants. A lot of people have already done the work for you. You don't have to start the stuff all over again. And for example, GDS, the Government Digital Service in the UK, they open source all their work because technically taxpayer money is going towards all this code. So they try and open source as much as possible, and then they've already done the work for you. There's no point in having to do it again. Yeah, and you have a single source of truth. If you have compliance as code, then you have a single place you can go look for it instead of having to dig through a bunch of emails and talk to a bunch of people. At one point I had no arguments about semantics, but more accurately it's less arguments about semantics, because if you've got an agreed upon standard, a DSL, domain specific language, you don't have to argue about oh, we should do this with a sed, we do it with awk, and that kind of stuff.
Fewer arguments about semantics.
Nice. Fewer arguments about semantics, yeah. And as I said, a lot of the requirements for these compliance standards, some of them aren't actually technological things. So if we go back to the HIPAA standards in there, some of them were stuff like you need a security guard outside of your data center and that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, we can't automate that stuff yet. So the more time you have to get rid of the technical stuff, the more you can sort of push the soft skill stuff away. So how does it actually look like in action? Let's pick a really basic example on how we would actually do this with config management tools. So talking about the CIS standards, you can actually go and get the CIS benchmarks there. So we're going to talk about a CentOS 7 machine. And here's CentOS 7 rule 123. I just picked the most basic one just to show, because I'm going to talk about trying to give the most basic example as I can. Obviously, there's going to be more complex ones. But the TLDR of this is that you should have GPT check equals 1 if you're on a Red Hat system and you want the standards, because hopefully your packages should be signed and GPT signed. It's not the greatest color there, but if you can see, this is a really basic example of how to do it in Puppet. You know, there's a million ways you could do this. You could use August, you could use you can manage the entire file, but to make things simple, I'm just going to use a file line. And if you're not familiar with Puppet, this is basically going to regex, look for GPT check 1. If it's there something else, it's going to change it. Oop, wrong way. And again, as I said, I work for Puppet, but I'm going to try and be as bipartisan as possible and give the other examples. So there might be some chef people out in the audience that probably say this is a better way of doing this, but this is just the first one I could find. So similar thing, use the replace or add resource, and then go through and look for GPT check. And then similar in Salt, look through the yum.conf, look for GPT check, and similar in Ansible. And as I said, no one put their hand up and say, there's actually a better way of doing this, because I'm most experienced with Puppet. I just went for the most basic solution that kind of illustrates what you're doing. So one of the things that comes up a lot, so I do pro services, so one of the sort of basic requirements for Puppet for pro services is someone's come along and told us that we need to be, PCI compliant or something like that, and they want some config management to do it. And there's a few different approaches to how you actually use config management to do this. So one would be, you already have a bunch of config management code, and then you basically just make sure that code you've already written gives you the compliance you need. So for example, I'm going to give a Puppet example here. For that yum check we had before, maybe you already have a yum module that you've got, and you just go in there and change the parameter to make sure that GPT check equals 1. So that's the method I recommend the most. You should be using the existing tooling that you've got. But I talked about silos earlier on. Sometimes someone's primary use case for compliance and config management is just for compliance, for nothing else. They just want to use this tool. Maybe they've got a different tool and they're using this just for this one area. So in that case, you might use a dedicated CIS module or STIG module or something like that, and then you actually use it for that way. And a lot of people end up using some sort of, if they're using their compliance tooling as a scanner as well, so not just enforcing it, or maybe they can't enforce it because again, they're very siloed. Maybe they've got a change freeze, but they need to scan through your system. Most config management tools have some sort of dry run mode. In Puppet, it's no op. In Chef, it's try run. In Ansible, I think it's dry run. Anyone? Is it dry run in Ansible? Check, just check, yeah, that's it. And then I think anyone Salt in the room? Is there a dry run in Salt? Testing is true. Okay, makes sense. So some people, if they're in a siloed place or somewhere where they can't easily, they're moving on that journey and they can't easily just run stuff on their systems, they can run stuff in a dry run mode and go through that. So there's a few approaches you can do here. And remember we talked about share and reuse. We don't want to have to write all this stuff all over again because lots of people have done it for us. So one of the ones out there is devsec.io. It's just a website where there's been a bunch of code written in Chef, Puppet, and Ansible. Lots of pre-existing stuff for this. They're not perfect. Again, as we said, need to find something and don't just immediately implement it. There's some comments on there saying this doesn't follow that in the right way, but there's some good stuff out there, and there's a lot of existing code that you can use. So that's devsec.io. So there's SIMP, the System Integrity Management Platform. This is an entire stack written by Onyx Point. So this was something that they built for the NSA and for other American government systems. And the idea is that the SIMP stack is Puppet with a bunch of pre-written modules that follow the SIMP NIST standards over in the States, or the NSA standards. And then they have some cool stuff on top. They've actually got a really cool kind of hire tool that will go through and it will actually write compliance logs and write those kind of reports that all your compliance people like, HTML reports that say this is what's changed from the Puppet run you just had. And some of that stuff isn't public yet, but if you talk to Trevor Vaughan on the Puppet Slack in the security room, he'll talk about that stuff. One way. There's Ansible log, and again, this is just some quick perusing. As I said, I'm mainly Puppet, and I'm trying to be bipartisan as possible. If there's other stuff, come talk to me afterwards, and I can add in for next time. There's Ansible Lockdown. Ansible partnered up with a security partner, and they wrote some, I think these are specifically, yeah, these are the STIG standards, so they've written some pre-written playbooks for the STIG standards. And for all this stuff, you go on the community hubs, so if you go to the forge, you go to the cookbooks, you go to Galaxy. If you look up like a CIS or STIG, lots of people have written this code before you. So don't write all the stuff yourself if you have to. Try and use something that someone's written before and fork it if you need to. However, there's two parts to IT compliance. There's the enforcement and then there's reporting. So config management can be used for both, but I tend to sort of say that you want to use the config management part for the enforcing and use a separate tool for reporting. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that, as you said, some of the stuff can't be caught with config management as much. The other thing is that for certain standards, that one. Yeah. So for certain standards, there are what are known as ASVs. So for certain compliance standards, only people that have been officially given the sort of kosher stamp of like, this is the thing you can do that. So sometimes you can't use Puppet or Chef or whatever because it's not been signed off yet. So. And the sad part is we're at FOSDEM. So the sad part is there's not as many open source versions of compliance tools because compliance, it's a big business. It's lots of enterprise companies. They have lots of closed source software. And I'm not saying that those tools aren't good. I've actually had some pretty interesting conversations with the Nessus team about some of this stuff. But we're at FOSDEM, so let's talk about open source stuff. So the most popular one, and this is something there's actually, I think I looked through the FOSDEM schedule, and there's been, I think there's 2 or 3 talks about OpenSCAP. It's probably the most popular one out there. There's lots of tooling around it. Red Hat maintain a lot of stuff for it. There's lots of pre-existing standards for things like FISMA and DSS. And yeah, it plugs into a lot of things. So the most basic implementation of that is the actual command line tool. So this is me running it on a Vagrant box. I'm just using it. I'm just doing a yum install to install it. I'm running an eval with the most basic report. And then it gives me a file on disk, like an actual HTML file that I can look through and see all those compliance standards. There's also the SCAP workbench, which is just a GUI for this, and this works with SSH as well, so you can do it on remote systems. Just means it's slightly easier than having to do it on the command line. As I said, one of the good things about OpenSCAP is that because it's a standard, people have written a lot of tools to use it. So you don't have to do it on the command line. You don't have to do it exactly with the benchmark. There are other ways. There's APIs and stuff like that. So Foreman actually has a plugin for this, and Satellite is built on top of Foreman, so Satellite also has an OpenSCAP scanner. And funnily enough, I just added this slide in 5 minutes ago because I checked, and there's actually a talk about doing Foreman with OpenSCAP. So if you want to go learn more about that, there's actually a talk tomorrow in the security track, so go see that. As well as OpenSCAP, the only one I saw is Linus. I think this is fairly new. I think it's about 2 or 3 years old at this point. And it's pretty cool. It's open source. It works on a lot of platforms. It's fairly simple to install. I think it's just a binary that you can get. The sad thing is that the actual compliance standard plugins, so the way it works is it has like a sort of base system, and then you have plugins for the various compliance standards you got. But the compliance standards are actually, they're commercial and they're not open source. So you can run it on a basic overall scan that looks something like this. I can't really see it, but the idea is that you run it on your system and it just goes through and looks at the sort of standard stuff, make sure etc password has the right permissions, make sure that your grub has password and that kind of stuff. And the last one, which people don't talk about so much, is using Packer for compliance. So there's actually a really good talk by Werner Buck at the last HashiConf, and he was talking about how they use Packer with AWS and AMIs to do compliance. Because some of the compliance standards, especially on things like file mounts and grub settings and things like that, they're hard to do on running systems. It's the kind of thing you probably want to bake into your golden image process sort of earlier on in the stack because it makes it a lot easier to do. And yeah, HashiCorp do awesome products, and Packer does a lot of this cool stuff. And the thing about Packer is it has provisioners for pretty much all the popular config management tools out there. So, it has a shell provisioner, puppet provisioner, chef provisioner. So you can use that code that you've already written to use it and bake it into your AMIs and your various kind of golden image things. So how do we actually report on this stuff other than using OpenSCAP and Linus and that kind of stuff? There's what I know as system testing DSLs. So the most popular one, who everyone's heard of. So who here has heard of Server Spec or is even using Server Spec? All right, cool. There's like 20, 30 people. All right, so it's fairly popular. And if you're not familiar with it, it looks something like this. It's basically, if you're familiar with RSpec, it looks something like this. Basically, sort of RSpec helpers to do things like check, like files are on system and they have the right permissions. So here's a really basic CIS check. It's for the one we talked about earlier on, the GPG. And it basically goes through, make sure that's all there. So you run this on your system, and it gives you a thing saying, nope, that file's not there, or it has the wrong permissions. So Server Spec is so popular that it's inspired a bunch of other kind of forks of it. So you've got GOS, which is pretty much the same thing, but written in Go. You've got Infratester, which is basically the same thing, but with reserved keywords for things like HTTP requests and headers and MySQL and stuff like that. You've got Gauntlet, which is more of a BDD version of this, and similar with BDD security. So those are same, they're written in Gherkin, they're feature files that you run, but it's basically wrappers around actual security tools. So things like making sure that your, that's more of a kind of AppSec kind of side of it, but you can do some of that for your compliance stuff as well. And even though it's competitor, I probably should mention this because it's quite a cool tool. Inspex by Chef, it's pretty much kind of like a clean room kind of fork of Server Spec. It works in a similar way. It looks something like this. Again, I probably should have chosen better colors for this, but the idea is that it just extended keywords on top of Server Spec kind of language to say, this is the compliance rule and it's this level of security and it has these tags. And then the code itself looks quite similar. Path config file, etc.yum.conf should contain GPG check is 1. And then there's a talk at Config Management Camp 2016 about using this. And actually, the beginning part of it is quite similar to talking about how compliance shouldn't be a bunch of papers and it should be actual code that you can give out and stuff like that. So, what did we learn? Compliance is enforcement of standards. It's not security, but it's part of a security flow. And in the best case, it should be moved left. You shouldn't be throwing this stuff over the fence at the last minute. Yeah, as we said, compliance responsibility can be tricky. Like, who ultimately is actually responsible for this stuff? Is it the ops team? Is it the security team? Do you have a dedicated compliance team? Config management fits really well with the compliance kind of use case. The idea that you have to enforce standards based on that is pretty close. And regardless of the tool you use, there's a lot of pre-existing work, so don't just start all over again. And enforcement is just part of the puzzle. Reporting is out there as well, and unfortunately there's not much open source software for this stuff, but there is lots of existing tools that you can use. But ultimately, depending on the compliance standard you're following, you might actually have to use a commercial product because they're the ones that have been signed off for it, especially things like PCI. So if you want to know more, there's a bunch of awesome talks that are out there. This one from last year's PublicConf, it's actually Trevor talking about SIMP and how it all works and having open source compliance. They talk about more of the complex use cases. They actually have some pretty cool stuff where when they were testing all of their STIG compliance stuff, they were using Beaker, which is like a test kitchen-like sort of automation tool, and they actually caught a bunch of kernel bugs in various Linux distributions. So using this automated software and using this, they actually caught problems both in the compliance standards and in the actual upstream, which is pretty cool. And if you've not read the DevOps handbook, there's a really good section by Gene Kim and others. There's a really good section on compliance, and so there's a lot of it's hard to find a lot of real-life use cases of compliance stuff because people don't like talking about their compliance because legal stuff, people get scared about it. But they have a bunch of case studies in there that's really good. So I've gone way faster than I thought I would. So when I time myself doing this at home, I did about 35 minutes, but I've done this in about 25. So we've got lots of time for questions if people have questions. No? Okay, then I guess I'll go, oh, we're going up here.
So for the, let's say for all the different compliance standards that it does support, is it accepted by auditors?
I think for some it is. I know for PCI it isn't. I went through the ASVs for PCI and unfortunately OpenSCAP isn't. But the general use case I've seen for it and talking to companies that use it is that it's a good way of catching that stuff before you have to hand it over to the official scanner kind of team So it means that you can bring stuff on earlier on instead of having all that stuff out there and then having it back and going, oh no, everything's gone wrong, the Nest scan caught this stuff. You can bring it earlier on.
I think the reason that it's not accepted for PCI DSS is there may not be specific PCI DSS
Oh, sorry.
for it. That may change.
Okay, yeah, so the question was, is OpenSCAP signed off for compliance standards? And the answer is, it depends. I know for PCI DSS it isn't, but yeah, it depends on the standards, and a lot of the time, people kind of use it internally for their ops team, and then the compliance team handle the actual kind of official audit compliance plan. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, sorry about going too fast, and come on and talk to me if you have any more questions. Thanks very much.